At the very heart of Christian origins, there's this profound question. What if the earliest church wasn't some brand new movement, but actually the restoration of a much older, almost forgotten faith? Today, we're going to explore a theory that really shifts our entire understanding of Christianity's foundations, connecting it to a world that had vanished centuries before. Okay, so our investigation is going to start with a puzzle, and it's a big one, right in the book of Revelation. This text, which is so foundational to Christianity, is just filled with these visions of a heavenly temple, a divine throne, and angelic priests. Now, for a faith that we're often told broke away from temple worship, this is a really strange and persistent feature. So where on earth is all this imagery coming from? Well, a common explanation you'll hear is that these visions were inspired by the court rituals of the Roman Empire. But this theory has a pretty big problem. How would fishermen and artisans from a place like Galilee have gotten this intimate, detailed knowledge of the emperor's throne room? I mean, the connection just feels tenuous at best. So maybe we've been looking in the wrong place this whole time. What if the key isn't in the Roman world at all, but in the powerful memory, almost like the ghost, of a world that had long since disappeared? And this is the central argument of the scholar Margaret Barker. She argues that the key to understanding early Christianity isn't the Second Temple, the one that was standing in Jesus' day. No, it's the First Temple, the one that was destroyed by Babylon 600 years before Jesus was even born. So let's back up. The First Temple, built by King Solomon, was the absolute heart of Israelite religion for 4 centuries. And it was way more than just a building. It was seen as the whole cosmos in miniature, the literal meeting place of heaven and earth. So when it was physically destroyed in 586 BCE, the structure was gone, but its powerful memory, that wasn't erased. Now, while there are very few physical remains of Solomon's temple, the argument is that its real legacy is all around us. It survives in the architectural blueprint of churches, in the structure of the most ancient Christian liturgies, and, most importantly, in the theological DNA of the New Testament itself. To really wrap our heads around this theory, we have to understand that Judaism in Jesus' time was not this single, unified thing. There was a deep ideological conflict going on between 2 traditions, and each one was represented by a totally different vision of the temple. The conflict was really between 2 completely different worldviews. On one side, you had what we're calling the First Temple memory. This was a dissident tradition that honored the faith of Abraham, the ancient priesthood of a figure named Melchizedek, and the anointed Messiah kings. And on the other side, you had the Second Temple reality, the official state religion centered on the law of Moses, the priesthood of Aaron, and a historical narrative that was actually pretty hostile to that old monarchy. And what's wild is that texts that preserved this dissident memory were often just excluded from the official Hebrew scriptures. For example, the Book of Enoch, which was considered scripture by a lot of early Christians, makes this absolutely explosive accusation that the scribes of the Second Temple had deliberately altered and corrupted the holy texts. So for these dissident groups, the return from the Babylonian exile had been a total failure. They looked at the new temple and saw it as a corruption, an impure counterfeit. As far as they were concerned, they were still living in a long exile, and they were waiting for a true restoration and the rebuilding of the true temple. And this brings us to the figure who connects that ancient memory to all the claims being made about Jesus, this mysterious priest-king, Melchizedek. Now, Melchizedek only appears briefly in the Old Testament, but he's incredibly significant. He was the priest-king of Jerusalem way back in the time of Abraham, centuries before Moses and Aaron were even on the scene. His priesthood represented an older and, according to this dissident tradition, a more authentic, a more pure form of the faith. And this is absolutely crucial. The letter to the Hebrews argues that Jesus' authority as a high priest doesn't come from the established Aaronic priesthood of the Second Temple. No, it comes from the more ancient and superior order of Melchizedek. This directly identified him as the true heir to that First Temple tradition. Now, for centuries, you could have just looked at this and said, okay, that's a clever theological argument. But then, the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls changed everything. Specifically, a text they labeled 11Q13, also known as the Melchizedek text. This scroll, which was written more than a century before Jesus, reveals an incredible expectation. There were Jewish groups who were actively waiting for the return of a divine Melchizedek figure. They believed he would come at the end of days as this heavenly judge and redeemer to rescue his people.
The timeline here is it's really revealing. First, you have this pre-Christian expectation of a returning Melchizedek. Then, Jesus' ministry aligns perfectly with that role. And finally, the New Testament writers come along and make the connection explicit. Jesus is the one they were waiting for. He is the awaited Melchizedek.
So, when we start to assemble all these pieces, the picture of Christian origins just changes dramatically. It no longer looks like the invention of a new religion, but something else entirely. Let's just walk through the logic here. You have an ancient tradition that remembered the First Temple's theology, and it saw the Second Temple as a total corruption. Then, Jesus was presented as the embodiment of that older tradition, the return of the true priest-king Melchizedek. So the conclusion is pretty much inescapable. His followers saw what he was doing not as an innovation, but as a restoration.
And, this perspective actually solves a major historical problem. How did Christian theology get so complex so fast? How did a movement of Galilean peasants produce these sophisticated doctrines about a divine Son of God, an atonement, and a heavenly priesthood in less than 20 years?
Well, the answer, according to this theory, is that Christian theology wasn't invented from scratch at all. It was the unveiling of a pre-existing, fully formed system of belief that had been preserved for centuries within these dissident streams of Jewish thought. As Margaret Barker puts it, Christian doctrine was the expression of a long-established set of beliefs in the light of the life and work of Jesus. Jesus was the key that unlocked and made public this ancient, hidden tradition.
So, core Christian concepts that we've often attributed to later Greek philosophical influence, things like the Incarnation, the Son of God, holy wisdom, even the idea of becoming divine, are actually revealed to have these incredibly deep roots in Israel's original temple theology. These ideas weren't borrowed, they were reclaimed.
And so, we arrive at the final, powerful conclusion of this perspective. The faith of Solomon's temple didn't just vanish in 586 BCE. It went underground, it was preserved by these minority traditions, and it ultimately reemerged, transformed and unveiled as what we now call Christianity. This framework really challenges us to rethink the relationship between Judaism and Christianity, the very nature of the New Testament, and the identity of Jesus himself. If Christianity was a restoration and not a revolution, what other long-held assumptions might we need to re-examine?